Welcome back to my Wetland Plant Identification class. I'm Abe, your instructor, and this unit is focusing on bogs. And there are many types of bogs, and they're probably most similar to fens in that they accumulate peat over time, but instead of accumulating sedgy peat, they accumulate sphagnum peat. And some bogs float, some bogs actually quake because they're so shallow on the surface. Most bogs don't have too many trees, but this one does have a few trees. The sphagnum is so dominant in the ecosystems that it actually will control the pH and really control the hydrology in many cases. And bogs are usually typified by more acidic pH because they're fed more by rainwater than by a real ambitrophic bog is fed only by rainwater. Sometimes there might be a little bit of, here we have a lake here, so it's probably also getting water from a small creek or some groundwater flow as well. But the sphagnum has this ability to float on top of the water and isolate the plants growing on the sphagnum from the rest of the hydrology because it'll actually build up over time above the water table. So let me just show you the sphagnum here. We could dig down into the sphagnum and see that it just keeps on going down and down and down, and because it's always wet, things decompose really slowly. And so these are old sphagnum moss plants that just over time, over thousands of years, might lose their sphagnum moss appearance and look more like just brown indescript carbon. And eventually it'll turn into coal over millions of years. So the flora here in this summer lake bog is, I think, characteristic of a ambitrophic bog, and we get a lot of a few sedges like we saw in the fen, some new ones. We get a lot of things in the Ericaceae or the heath family. Things related to rhododendrons and things related to cranberries and blueberries. And our special emphasis for this week is going to be on those ericaceous shrubs. They're really hardy. They have a lot of adaptations to dealing with both a lot of moisture and also moisture stress, because in many parts of the world, bogs will freeze solid in the winter, and that could be really stressful on the plant if they have these evergreen leaves that are above the snow and ice, but the roots are frozen. And so those leaves are getting cold winds and sunshine during the wintertime when they're frozen. So anyway, bog plants often have to deal with not only lots of water, but also moisture stress in the wintertime when it is totally frozen. Now, a lot of plants don't have to worry about that because they just go they die back to a perennial rhizome, but we see a lot of shrubs here in this bog, and those shrubs need those types of adaptations. So that's a little bit of an overview of this community. We are at Summer Lake, which is kind of halfway between the Stillaguamish River mouth and the Skagit River mouth. And this is an area without a lot of topography, which is, bogs usually form in really flat areas. Sometimes they form over thousands of years as lakes gradually fill in with peat, and that's sort of what is happening in this situation here. So maybe in 10,000 more years, this bog mat will extend all the way across the lake, and then it'll have the ability to really get a lot more acidic than it is now. We have a special guest with us today, Vicki Jackson, and Vicki is a friend and a fellow member of the Washington Native Plant Society, and she runs an amphibian monitoring program. She's mentored my wife in wetland ecology and spent her career as a consultant doing ecological consulting in Whatcom County. So I'm really excited to have her with us. She actually did her master's research on bogs, and so she'll probably be correcting me here or there, or at least providing some really great tips on the bog ecology and Flora. She's very diverse interests in natural history, ranging from plants and amphibians, and she's a bird lover as well. So I'll let Vicki maybe add a few notes about the bog ecology here at Summer Lake, and maybe a bit in general. And so here's Vicki.
Hi. I love being out here in the bog. I've been here, I was just sitting here thinking, I think I've been coming to this bog for about 25 years. So in that, it sounds like a long time from a human perspective, but from a natural history perspective, very little has changed here. It's very much the same, and thank goodness people haven't trashed it. It's just a wonderful place. But it is one of our best illustrations in our local area of a bog community that kind of gives us that full breadth of the sedges, the sphagnum mats, the woody vegetation on the drier parts of the bogs, to give us just kind of a really excellent look at a bog ecology in this area. This does have kind of a fun little treat in that somebody has actually introduced some carnivorous plants in this system. So I'm sure Abe will be sharing that along the way today, getting a peek at those. They're from other regions. They don't seem to be causing any problem here, but they're quite interesting. My background in here did start, as Abe mentioned, is doing my master's work on a bog in Whatcom County, and so I've had a kind of a lifelong interest in bogs from that point. And I've been working as a wetland ecologist for the last 27 years, and I just recently retired, and now I spend more of my time chasing amphibians as part of the Whatcom County Amphibian Monitoring Program. But I'm constantly amazed and love botany, and it's always part of what I do. I want to introduce you to a really cool plant that you're probably not going to see anywhere else, but it is right down here. It's called Schuzeria palustris, which it doesn't really have a common name other than Schuzeria. And it is a small little plant that looks a lot like a rush, kind of sitting like or a young little carex sitting near it. But when it's in fruit, it has these really almost alien-looking pod-like fruits that are in here. Other than that, it has small little white flowers when it's flowering in the spring. And if you don't have either of those features, you can identify it by their little tiny leaves, which look like any other leaf, except for if you look carefully at the very end, there's a little tiny pore at the end. So that's kind of your belly botany for the day out here. These are always found in kind of real moist environments that are in the sphagnum mat around this bog. Along with the little cranberries that are in here and the sundews that are in here, and some of the other rushes. They're not going to be up in the area where the sedges or the woody material is, like the rhododendrons and the kalmias. So they're a fun, alien, unusual plant to find in Summer Lake Bog.
This here is a member of the carrot family, the Apiaceae. And in past units, we've seen actually other members of the same genus, Angelica. This is Angelica genuflexa, and I often find this growing on logs or the edges of bog mats like it is here. Now, a good feature, besides the fact that it has this umbel of white flowers like many of the carrot relatives, the best feature for the Angelica genuflexa is that the leaves are kind of kinked downwards. Genuflect means to bow or kneel, and so they call this the kneeling angelica as a common name because the leaves do this kink thing where they arch downwards. So it has a pinnate leaf, pinnately compound leaf that genuflects, and it also has very large leaf bases. So that's Angelica genuflexa. I think the plant that it is most easily confused with is Cicuta douglasia, or Douglas water hemlock, and I'm hoping we'll see that as well. Both of them actually have chambered stems, which is one feature that people often use to distinguish Cicuta from other carrot members, but that chambered root just is an adaptation for kind of like parenchymus tissue. It's an adaptation for dealing with the aquatic environment and enables the plant to diffuse gases down into the root area. Here we have a really small plant, and this plant is actually carnivorous. So it has these, this is called Drosera rotundiflora, or roundleaf sundew. And it's called sundew because it has these drops on the leaves that look a little bit like dew, but they're actually sticky drops that will cause they attract insects and they cause insects to get stuck. So there's actually a little insect right here. And why is it that we would have a carnivorous plant in a bog? That's a good question. Well, this environment is really nutrient poor. Bogs in general are primarily fed by rainwater, and unlike all the other wetland types where you have water that is dissolving nutrients before it runs into a wetland, the water is coming straight from the sky, and it's basically like distilled water, so it doesn't really have any nutrients in it. So bogs are classically nutrient poor, and that means that plants have to deal with very little nutrients, and this one has its own mechanism of getting nitrogen. It captures these flies, and it doesn't physically eat them, but the flies decompose over time and release the nutrient that is in the fly to the roots of the plant. So the sundew is flowering right now. It has this central raceme of white flowers. I guess many of the flower buds aren't fully open yet. And we will, this is a native carnivorous plant, but as Vicki mentioned, there are a number of other carnivorous plants on this site here that have been introduced. So this is Drosera rotundifolia. Here we have a really small sedge, almost as small as the Carex pauciflora that we saw at Daly Prairie. This one has usually a terminal spikelet and just a few flowers. This spike just has about 10 flowers. At the very tip is the male flower, and then all the other ones are around the outside, or on the sides. So I think the small stature, terminal spike, and with a male flower at the end are all good features for the Carex leptalia. We got another sedge here. This one is really common in bogs, and I often see it on the edge, open water edge of bogs. This is a cespitose species, so it grows in clumps, and it's called Carex cassicii, or Cussock sedge. Now, I recognize it by kind of this unkempt look. It has these long culms that often arch to the side, and the spikelets or spikes are sessile, and they range in size quite a bit. So this one is pretty long, whereas the ones towards the tip are pretty short. There's a little bit of space between each of the spikelets. So this is perhaps one of the more robust species, not the most, but one of the more robust species found in a bog.
Now we're going to talk about a couple of the really common shrubs that are in bog systems. The first one is Kalmia microflorum. This is the bog laurel, and it looks very much like the other one we're going to talk about, which is Rhododendron greenlandicum, which is the Labrador tea. The first one, the bog laurel, is right here, and you can see it's just kind of a scraggly little shrub. It has very shiny leaves on it. And on the underside of these, you'll find that they're just kind of a pale white, there's no fur. When they're in flower, they have a brilliant, kind of unforgettable little pretty azalea-like pink flower. And they typically bloom really early in the season. The other shrub that we're going to be talking about is right behind it and looks almost identical, But this is the Rhododendron greenlandicum, or Labrador tea. And this plant has a leaf that's not as shiny on the surface, kind of a dull look. And if you turn them over, they have a rust to white, woolly underside. They also have a very distinctive, awesome smell that gives the bog kind of a wonderful smell. And that plant also blooms. They can overlap with a bog laurel, but blooms a little later. We have a few back here that are blooming. You can get that right here. They're late bloomers, and they have a white cluster of little rhododendron mini flowers. Both these species are very important dominant species of the understory of a bog when you're getting in the drier sections of a bog. So you won't see them in the wettest spots. They'll be up in the areas where the water table is actually getting separated from the lower water table under there. So these plants are truly ombrotrophic species that get all of their water primarily from the rainwater that's coming from the sky.
This is bog cranberry, kind of carpeting the sphagnum here, or Vaccinium oxycoccus. And the bog cranberry is very common in bogs, but it'll also show up in fens. But in either case, it really likes growing on the sphagnum moss. And it's a member of the Ericaceae, or the heath family, like the Kalmia and the rhododendron. But this one has a flower that is more similar, I guess, to the rhododendron in that it has these pink petals that actually spread out, whereas a lot of the other Ericaceae have urn-shaped flowers, and the lobes at the tip of the urn don't spread that much. These have long spreading lobes. And we're all pretty familiar with what the fruit looks like, although the cultivated cranberry is actually native to eastern North America and is bigger. So these bog cranberries are about half the size or a quarter the size of the cultivated cranberries. Nevertheless, they are quite tasty. So anyway, bog cranberry is easily recognizable by these small leaves and the vines that either trail right along the ground or just arch up a little bit off of the sphagnum moss. It has alternate leaves. And that pink flower and a red berry that ripens to red. I have two cranberry plants here that are just starting to go to fruit. So the fruits are far from ripe. Usually they ripen in October. They're one of our last ripening fruits. And a couple, so sometimes the cultivated cranberry Vaccinium macrocarpum shows up in our bogs in western Washington. So you could tell them apart when they're in flower or fruit by looking at the stalks on the fruit or flowers. So with Vaccinium oxycoccus, usually they arise singly out of the side of the plant, whereas in Vaccinium macrocarpum, often they're in two or three coming out of the side of the plant. And then this stalk holding up the flower or fruit, called the peduncle, on Vaccinium oxycoccus, it has these two little bract-like leaves that are towards the middle of that stem, whereas on Vaccinium macrocarpum, those leafy things are they're bracts, they're a lot bigger, and they're usually in the upper third of the stem. So those are good features for distinguishing the two, but they're both native to North America, but only the Vaccinium oxycoccus is native to western Washington. Here is Rhynchospora alba. This is a member of the Cyperaceae, or the sedge family, but unlike many of the sedges that we've been learning, this one isn't in the Carex genus, and it doesn't have a triangular or an edgy stem. It's a round stem. Now this one is almost always growing in very wet, peaty areas, and usually doesn't get more than about a foot tall. And we can see here that it's actually quite close to the edge of the water where the the peat is lower and wetter. And it's easily recognizable by the white scales that surround the flowers. So many of the sedges have dark scales, but the Rhynchosporas, well, this Rhynchospora alba has white scales. Rhyncho means beak and spora seed, so the seed is kind of beak-shaped. This is a pretty exciting portion of the bog that quakes when you jiggle like a water mattress. And next to me is an unusual plant. It's not native to this region at all, but it's called Sarracena flava. Now, all the Sarracenas are commonly called pitcher plants because like a pitcher that you might put water in, they have these long tubes that will actually fill up with water, and insects crawl down in there and they can't crawl back out. And so they have another adaptation for dealing with the ombotrophic environment or nutrient poor environment by capturing their own nitrogen as the insects decompose in those pitchers. So flava means yellow. This obviously is a very yellow looking plant. Looks like it does a lot of the reproduction photosynthesis on these tubes because the leaves are pretty small. But because it gets extra nutrients from the insects it captures, maybe it doesn't have to do quite as much photosynthesis. This is Lycopus uniflorus. It is a member of the mint family, and all the mints have opposite leaves. This, unlike a lot of mints though, it doesn't have much of a little bit of an aroma, but a lot of the mints are very aromatic. The mint family is also typified by square stems, and this does have a square stem. So Lycopus usually grows on sphagnum mats near the water or on logs that are actually floating on the water. It's quite common to see it growing there. The leaf margins are serrated, we can see. And it has a root that is a little bit hollow in the middle. Let's see if I can get it out. So it's kind of this spongy rhizome-like root with all these little rhizoids coming off the side. And this time of the year, it's probably a little bit harder during the winter, but it has moved a lot of those nutrients up into the plant, and so the root is pretty spongy in the summertime. The flowers will be borne in the leaf axils, and they'll be white. We have two species of Lycopus. This is the Lycopus uniflora. And then beyond that plant, right along the edge here, is a juncus, a rush, and this is Juncus canadensis. It's actually a non-native juncus. Most of our juncus species are native. And this one, we could see that last year's stems are here as well, and they have pretty dense clusters of capsules and flowers, or I should say flowers first, and then they become capsules. But the inflorescence branches, so we have quite a few branches with those clusters of spikes on the end. And this time of the year, they haven't really filled out, so it's a little more congested looking. The leaves are round, and the plant usually has a fairly upright expression. I think it looks quite a bit like the Juncus articulatus that we have seen in the estuary, estuarine salt marshes, but this does not root nodally, and it doesn't have these kind of arching stems. Usually they just are straight up. Juncus canadensis. Did somebody plant cotton here in the bog? This is a plant called cotton grass commonly, or Areophorum chamasonis, and there are a couple different species, actually 3 or 4 different species in the state of cotton grass, but Areophorum chamasonis is distinctive in that it only has one clump of, or one spike on all these seeds, with long perianth bristles come from just one spike. So obviously it's dispersed by wind, and does pretty well in the bog environment. Sometimes it'll show up in fens as well. Now this bog has another species of Areophorum that's not as developed. It will have cottony seed heads like that later in the year, but this is Areophorum angustifolium, sorry, Areophorum virginianicum. And this species is can easily be recognized by these leafy bracts that stick up, often up above the inflorescence, making the inflorescence or the spikes look more lateral. But they're still terminal spikes. You can see I could just fold these bracts down, and this one has 5 spikes that are all crowded at the tip. This one here I think just has, it also has 5 spikes. We usually think of dogwoods as being shrubs, big shrubs, but this dogwood here, Cornus unalasgensis, is very small, just 4 inches tall probably, and has these red fruits or berries that are actually edible and pretty tasty in my opinion, but the seeds are large, so if you eat them, just be aware that you don't want to break your teeth on the stony seeds. Now, instead of having just a pair of opposite leaves, these typically have 6 leaves that are all arranged in a whorl. And then look down below, there's actually, this one has another whorl. That's not always the case. See, this one just has 1 whorl at the top, but sometimes you'll see that there are further leaves down the stem. This one just has 2 further down the stem and 4 on top. So there is some variability, but even numbers because of the opposite nature of dogwoods in general. In the spring, this has a flower that is surrounded by big white bracts that look like they're actually the flower petals, but if you look carefully, all the actual flowers are crowded in the center, and they have a little more of a purplish color to them, the actual petals. Here's a plant that's all field marked. It's called 3-way sedge, and you really can see how the leaves stick out in 3 different directions when viewed from the top or the bottom. This is in the Cyperaceae, the sedge family, but it's a genus that, as far as I know, this is the only member of the genus. It's Dolichurium arundinaceum. And the spikes are borne in these axial, it has axial spikes with short peduncles. They're upright spikes, and they're pretty linear. Each flower is pretty linear. We have Lysomachia europea, subspecies arctica, or Arctic starflower, growing down here, and used to be in the genus Trientellus, but the taxonomists have made us work a little extra hard for this one by changing the name recently. And this particular type of starflower is always found in sphagnum, usually associated with cranberries pretty strongly. It is a smaller starflower than the broadleaf starflower, which we see in woodlands in western Washington, and it has usually just one flower that looks star-like with big white petals. Notice how the stem, underneath this whorl of leaves at the top, the stem will also have a few leaves down the side. We got a really great sedge here. If you remember the Carex Flora that we saw at Daly Prairie, this is a very close relative of that. It has the dangling lateral female spikes with the terminal male spike that's upright. But instead of having brown scales that clasp the periginium, this one has these yellowish scales that don't really clasp it as much. This is Carex limosa, commonly called mud sedge. And I'm not going to pick this because it's a pretty unusual species and there aren't very many on the site at this site here. Carex limosa. We have a new species here. This is Hypericum anagaloides, or bog St. John's wort. Now it has opposite leaves, but they're really round on the tip and they're sessile, and it'll have a yellow flower. So all the Hypericums have yellow flowers and opposite leaves, but the only Hypericum that's found in a bog is this bog St. John's wort, Hypericum anagaloides. It's not always growing out of water like this. Sometimes you'll see it growing just in amongst the sphagnum peat. Trees usually aren't very common in bogs, but shore pine will sometimes show up. And shore pine is a pine that has needles in clusters of just 2. So if you try and yank out a single needle, usually you get a second one with it because they're in clusters of 2. So this is a small one. Behind me is a much bigger one. We can see that the bark is pretty deeply furrowed. The cones are quite small. And usually they're in an environment like this, they might be limited in the size that they can get because after they get really big, they start to get heavy and they could actually sink down into the bog mat, and then their roots get so wet that they'll die. So we only see the pines in this bog in areas that are a little bit higher. You could actually kind of see a little bit of a hummock over there. Sometimes you might get Sitka spruce or western red cedar on similar hummocks in the bog environment. But shore pine is the most likely candidate for a tree in a bog. Perhaps the most charismatic of the carnivorous plants is the Venus flytrap, not native to western Washington, but somebody has planted some here. And we can see that they have a more active fly catching mechanism where when a fly gets stuck on the inside, these 2 lobes will actually close, and they have these hairs to, this one is closed, to kind of help keep the fly on the inside. But it doesn't have a stomach per se, and similar to the other carnivorous plants, the fly just decomposes and the nutrients fall to the ground or washed to the ground by the rain and are made accessible to the roots. Now we're getting lucky here in that this Venus flytrap is actually flowering. It's probably the first time I've seen them in flower at this site here. So they have these big white petals. Another carnivorous plant, this is in the same family as the yellow pitcher plant, the Sarraceniaceae, I think is how you say it, the pitcher plant family. And it has the same strategy and everything, capturing insects in this tall pitcher. But look how pretty that variegated pitcher is. There are a few gallium species that show up in wetlands. We saw the Gallium palustra in the marsh unit. And this here is Gallium trifidum. I see it sometimes in fens and in bogs. And trifidum, a good feature is that many of the flowers have 3 petals. And the seeds, a lot of the gallium seeds, or gallium some people say, a lot of the seeds have Velcro-like hairs on them, or even straight hairs, but this one just doesn't have any hairs at all, so the seeds are hairless. And it's a species that has a little bit of grippiness, but not really, barely enough to stick to things. So many of the features are actually fairly similar to the Gallium palustra, but it just isn't so covered with flowers the way that the Gallium palustra was that we saw in the marsh unit. Cutting the corner too close.
Okay, I was still at the bottom.
One more carnivorous plant here in the same genus Sarracenia as the Sarracenia flava that we saw. This is Sarracenia purpurea. It does have a lot of purple on it, both on the pitcher and the sepals. So right now it is flowering, or it has a flowering stem up. And we could see that the pitchers form these kind of rings for each plant, so it's kind of a cespitous plant. The pitchers are a lot fatter than the other species that we've seen. Oh, this one, you can't see it on camera, I doubt, but it has a giant insect on the inside. The bug's like that long. And the inside of these pitchers are covered with downward pointed hairs, and that prevents the insects from crawling up once they get trapped in the water down below. If they didn't have those hairs, the insect would have a better chance of climbing up the inside wall of the pitcher. But ultimately they drown in the water in the base of the pitcher. I couldn't find all the species from our study list at Summer Lake Bog. Bogs don't quite have the same diversity as fens, and I bumped a few species that are usually found in both bogs and fens into the bog unit, but I happened to come back to a local fen to pick them up because they weren't at Summer Lake. So I'm at a very accessible fen called Cabin Pond, and it's near the snowplow sheds up off of Mount Baker Highway, right across the road, so to speak, or the highway from Silver Fir Campground. And this is a small little fen. You can see it's dominated by sedges here. There is a little bit of peat, but not very much. Anyway, the first plant I want to show you from this site is Cicuta douglasia. And this also, like I said, grows in bogs sometimes, and usually it'll grow on logs on the bog margin. And let's see, it's in the umbelliferae, so it has those umbelliferous flowers. These are compound umbels. And it has a hairless stem. One feature that a lot of people refer to relates to the leaves. They don't genuflect like the Angelica genuflexa. They're just bipinnate or twicely pinnate. But if you look at the leaflets, and specifically the veins on the leaflets, they tend to terminate at the valleys of the serrations, whereas the Angelica genuflexa and really all the other carrots, the veins tend to terminate at the peaks of the serrations. So it's a minute feature. It's not 100% reliable, but it's a pretty good feature. Then another feature is the chamberedness of the roots. So I'm going to show that to you. It'll take me a second to get it ready though. So I pulled one out of the ground, and we can see that it has a lot of these white roots that are long and skinny, and then in the center there is kind of more of a substantial root. So the root that's going to have the chambers in it is going to be that central root, especially right at the base of the plant. So let's go ahead and zoom in here, and I'll slice this in half. There we go. So quite obvious are these big chambers that allow some of that gas exchange to happen. Now, I mentioned that Angelica genuflexa has chambers too, but the chambers tend to be longer. The distance between the chambers is much more. And also this will kind of turn a little bit yellow as it ages when you slice it in half. So again, this plant is highly toxic, one of the most deadly poisonous plants in North America. So I want to be careful to wash my knife off before I cut any food with it. The stem to the leaves is very hollow and hairless. It lacks the constrictions that the Cium suave has. Remember, we saw the constrictions on the petiole at Tennant Lake of Siam suave. So that's a good way to tell it apart from Siam. And the leaves tend to be wider, whereas Siam leaflets tend to be longer and not so sharply serrated. All right, so this is Cicuta diglosia. Even though it's deadly poisonous, I'm always a little bit excited to see it because it's a good plant in my book. It's not a weedy species, so you only see it typically in more undisturbed sites. If you encounter a grass in a wetland that looks to be a fairly undisturbed wetland, a good candidate to look into right away is the genus Glyceria. These are commonly called manna grasses, and they're called manna because the spikes look a little bit like wheat, and manna means bread. And so, of course, bread's made from wheat, and so these spikelets look like little teeny wheat heads, wheat spikelets. I think of them also looking a little bit like rattlesnake tails. But there are really two options in the Glyceria genus for what the spikelets look like. They either are long and skinny and cylindrical, or they're shorter and fatter and usually laterally compressed. And it's those shorter, fatter, laterally compressed spikelets that look more like the rattlesnake tails. This one here is Glyceria elata, E-L-A-T-A, and I recognize this one because it has the more laterally compressed spikelets that are a little bit shorter, and it has a pretty open panicle. And then a good feature is that the leaves are really broad on this species. They can be a little more than ½ an inch wide. The manna grasses tend to have a fairly membranous ligule. So that's that structure where the leaf connects to the culm. I pull it away, we can see that white ligule kind of poking out. And they have sheaths that clasp the stem for most of their length. So this whole structure here is the sheath. And you can see that it is wrapped all the way around the stem, up from the joint where it starts all the way up to about here. So that's more than 75% of the length. So this again is Glyceria elata. So I decided to include one more wetland in this unit. Right now I'm at a fen that is behind the Silver Creek Fir Campground. Some people call it the Anderson Creek Road Fen. Anyway, we're hunting for a few more bog species that we didn't find, and I know that they're here. So our emphasis has been on vaccinium this week, or the ericaceous shrubs that show up in bogs, and I forgot to point out some vaccinium ovalifolium when we were down at Summer Lake, and so that's here and it's a little closer. So it shows up usually on the drier portions of bogs and fens, and in this case we see there's these kind of hummocks where old trees used to be, and we have a lot of those drier shrubby plants that show up on the hummocks. So we're going to check out this one over here, give you a little flavor for what walking through a wetland can be like. I often prefer to just go barefoot. Don't have to worry about overtopping my boots. So this here is the Vaccinium ovalifolium, and it is a blueberry. See, it has fruits that are blue, and the fruits are borne on these stalks that tend to be really short. And another good feature for identifying it in the spring when it's in flower is that the flowers actually come out before the leaves. So it has what's called precocious flowering because they come out so early. And the berries on this species are pretty tasty. This one is a little dried out, but I like it quite a bit. It'll show up in non-bog or fen areas also. Usually in western Washington, you need to get above about 1,000 feet before you start seeing it, and it'll make its way all the way up into subalpine meadows. But it is an ericaceous shrub in the genus Vaccinium, along with the bog cranberry that we saw. And you know, if you're lucky, you might find a bog specialist Vaccinium called bog blueberry, Vaccinium uliginosum. If you do see it in Washington, maybe let me know, because it's a species that I'm tracking. Shows up a lot in Oregon and in British Columbia, but for some reason you don't see it very much in Washington. There are two orchids that commonly show up in both fens and bogs. And we have the white bog orchid and the slender bog orchid. Beside me, no surprise, this is the white bog orchid. It has these showy white flowers that are easy to spot from a distance. And it can be a pretty robust species. I'd say between about 1 foot and maybe even 2.5 feet at the highest. Now, like all orchids, it's going to have leaves that have parallel veination, so the veins run from the base all the way to the tip. These leaves are kind of spirally arranged as you go up the stalk. And the flowers just have one line of symmetry. And the other I hope to see here is the slender bog orchid, Platanthera stricta. The second bog orchid is here. This is the slender bog orchid, or Platanthera stricta. Notice the flowers are a lot greener looking than those of the dilatata. Most of the other features look pretty similar though. It has leaves that are kind of spirally arranged along the stem. I'd say the flowers are a little bit smaller, but they really lack the whiteness. We got one more type of Areophorum, or cotton grass, right here, unmistakable for its fluffy seed heads that look just like cotton. But here I got a little sampling here. We can see that these ones have multiple spikes in their inflorescence, compared with the Areophorum chamasonis that just has one longer haired inflorescence. So this is the Areophorum angustifolium. All right, so that's it for the species that I'm going to add on at this site here. Beautiful, beautiful fen that has some marsh characters and some little boggy spots on top of floating logs. But you can see the mountains in the background. I don't know what it is about fens, but they always are picturesque. That covers all the plants I want to include in this unit. We found most of them at Summer Lake Bog, and the diversity of bogs is often a little less than some of the other wetlands, because in addition to having to deal with saturated soil conditions like all wetland plants, the bog plants also have to deal with very little nutrients and an acidic environment. So there are many abiotic stresses to bog plants, and it limits the diversity to some degree. That's all for this week. I hope you tune in next week. Our last unit is going to be on grassy plants, grasses, with an emphasis on weedy grasses as well as some native wetland grasses.